Welcome to Vintage SF. I'm Richard Rempel, and today I have a special guest, a bookseller, a writer, and an all-around great guide to the SF community. Welcome, Stephen E. Andrews.
Thanks very much, Richard. It's great to talk to you. After all our exchanges and comments and emails, it's actually really good to speak in person. And it's interesting, isn't it? I saw you had a postcard from Bruce in Toronto. I get postcards from Bruce as well. So, there's other people out there connecting with us, which is really good.
It is really interesting how this is working that way.
Yeah.
And, I've connected with Ira from SF Words of Wonder and Matt from Science Fiction Reads together. And they're in Toronto and Montana. And it becomes a smaller world with BookTube.
Yes, it does, doesn't it? Anyway, what are we going to talk about today?
I have a video that will be posted on Wednesday, and today this video will be posted on Friday. And in there, I was talking about how I first saw your channel. It actually just happened to come up in my YouTube feed.
Yeah, well, there's these. You do wonder sometimes if your stuff does come up. You know what I mean? Yeah.
And it was with you and Graham Bray, two grumpy old men talking about SF. That was one of the first inspirations for me to actually start reading more SF again and to think perhaps I could do this.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I was kind of wondering a little bit about perhaps how you started your channel, or what maybe was your impetus to start your channel.
Well, it was one of those things. My partner, who I call the Video Widow, as you will have noticed, she was saying to me, "Why don't you do it?" And I would look at things and think, "Oh, this is not great. I could do something better. I've worked in the industry a long time, what have you." And she said, "Well, why didn't you do it?" Because I wasn't doing any writing, which is usually my primary creative thing when I've got the time and the energy. And this would have been back in 2021. And I thought, well, I'll just get frustrated because my technical means are limited. And I've recently bought a new PC. And had I known I was going to do YouTube, I'd have bought something with twice as much RAM, because that prevents me from improving the quality. But it is what it is. So I just decided to do it September 3 years ago. So the channel has sort of just got over 3 years now. And just to give it a try. And it was very primitive to start with. And I think what got me doing it was the fact that I have these periods where I don't read SF, or my enthusiasm wanes. And I've been back into collecting and back into reading SF, because collecting is a big thing for me, as you know. And really, I thought, well, I'll just talk about what I've been buying and sort of go from there. And you know how it is. You found this yourself. You soon become addicted to it, and it becomes a habitual thing. So that really was it. And I have to give a shout out here to Matt at Bookbuild, because initially I was pumping the material out and not really getting anywhere. It's going very slowly. And then I sort of gained loads of subscribers in a few days. And a friend of mine, it was actually Graham, said, "Hey, there's this guy who's talking about you." And Matt said some very nice things, and we've interacted a bit. It'd be great to meet him one day. And it sort of went from there, really. So I'm still very grateful to Matt, who's a charismatic, interesting guy, and he's a natural born critic. So it was great for him to sort of give me some plaudits, which was really nice. And then it just sort of grew from there, really.
Well, I found you and Jules Burt and others really very welcoming to the community too. So I've had some connection with you. And I made a very big rookie mistake on my very first video, but it turned out to be something really good. I don't know if you had noticed, but when in the description of that video, I thought, oh, I'll just list all the people whose channels I've been starting to watch. And I put that, at that link there. And I didn't realize that you would be notified that I'd made a mention of you in my video. So all of a sudden, my first video, all these people I've been watching are watching me, and I was very, very surprised.
That's great, because I am a total klutz with that sort of thing, and I don't think I've ever used the app thing. And for somebody who likes science fiction, I'm a bit of a technophobe, really. So we sort of muddle through, really. But yeah, that went really well, because I saw your channel from the very first video, and my first thought was, here's somebody who is a similar age to me, because a lot of people doing SF booktube are younger. And I could see, from that first video where you said you had time to start reading SF again, I thought, well, this is really good, because even if you step away from it, there are moments when you find you're drawn back. And at the moment, even though I'm struggling to find things that I want to read, I've got plenty to read, but I'm struggling to find things that I really want to read that are grabbing me. But I know that'll pass and it'll come back. So it's been great to watch you on your journey. And you've been very systematic and organized. And it's been really nice watching you work through things like the Ace specials, whereas my approach tends to sort of chaotic. But that really reflects what I do in my job, because I work with books, because I've worked with books for 40 years.
And you're great at it.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure that a lot of the people watching will agree. We've bought a lot of books based on your recommendations.
Yeah, well, it's my job, and it sort of comes naturally. And of course, in the course of any given day, I will go from a Greek classic to a young adult book to a science fiction novel to something else with each individual customer. So there is that thing where you're always on your toes, and you build up a body of knowledge over a long time. And that's the way I work. It's the notions come to me in the same way, and it reflects the way that you can never tell what's going to come to you in a bookshop. So you just sort of go with it, really. And it's been very, very much that way. So it's kind of chaos theory, I guess.
And I think this is what separates your channel from all the rest that I watch, is that body of knowledge that you've gained over 40 plus years from reading and selling books.
Yeah.
So
I think really it's that, there are, you get the odd bookseller pops up on YouTube, but they're mostly young people, and nothing wrong with that. We need new blood, but I don't think there are many, if any, people who've been in the industry as long as me do, and with a specific sort of focus on SF, though I do other things, as you know. Somebody I like watching now and again is Steve Donahue, who obviously is very well read indeed. And he sort of covers all sorts of things. But one of the great things about him, and also about Scott Bradfield, the writer, do you watch Scott Bradfield? They're very broad, so they're not afraid to tackle things which might be considered lowbrow or pulpy or genre fiction. And again, you've got that happening with Michael K. Vaughan as well. Michael, likes his Robert E. Howard, but he sort of goes further as well, and that's good. And that's always been part of my thing, is to show people that genre science fiction is part of the corpus of literature. It isn't just something that's in a corner. It is something important that reflects the changes that we've been through since the end of the sort of 18th century, and the way we're going into the future is very, very important stuff, I think.
Well, I have a couple more questions, but then I want to talk about something that we would probably consider literature in science fiction. But before I get to that, I just want to make a comment. One of the things that really drew me to your channel and to you as well was when I found out that you, as a youth, loved John Wyndham as well.
Yeah, very much.
I actually just learned how to say his name properly also from BookTube, because I'd never heard anyone say it. So I was always saying Wyndham, but now I'm going to be saying Wyndham.
Well, naturally, I think people make a big deal about pronouncing things, and I'm more concerned with them being spelled correctly. But funnily enough, this copy of The Seeds of Time, I bought this the other day, and it's a really nice copy. It cost me £2, and it was printed in 1973, and this is the very edition that I bought around about that time. My original is in a bit of a state, and this was pristine. So any fan of John Wyndham's is a friend of mine, and I actually know his niece. I haven't seen her for a while because she's moved from the area, but I got talking to this lady where I work. This is probably about 10 years ago, and she was looking at John Wyndham books. I got talking to her, and she told me she was his niece. And if you look on the shelves behind me, you can see there's two prints. Just above the two prints, which we'll come on to later, there's a small wooden ornament just above the print, which would be on let's see, would be on your left. And that is the remnants of an ornament which belonged to John Wyndham. It's a little sailor in a little boat. And she gave me that. She gave me one of John Wyndham's ties as well, which I wore in a very early video. So, yeah, Wyndham was the second science fiction writer I read, I would say. And I remain a very big fan, very much so.
Who was the first?
The first was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and The Lost World, which is still a favourite book. And then came H.G. Wells. So, it was very, very solid English writers, even though I'm not English myself, because I'm from Wales. I live in England. It was very much something which formed my way of thinking and the sort of stylistic benefits of great English prose, which those writers displayed.
The one other question I want to ask you is, you talk a lot and champion a lot the British New Wave, and I've learned a lot in terms of what that is. Yeah. And I know because we are the same age. You were only 5 or 6 when Michael Moorcock was at New Wave or New Worlds doing some of this stuff. So how did you come to love New Wave British literature?
Well, it actually came through an American writer, because the first time I heard the phrase New Wave was on the legend on the back of this book, Harlan Ellison's Deathbird Stories, which is probably my second favourite Ellison collection after The Beast That Shouted Love at the Heart of the World, which is one of my favourite books of all time. And I read this round about 1980, and it says on the back of this that a quote from the New Yorker, which is the chief prophet of the new wave in science fiction. And as you can see, this is a pan lozenge edition. That's a term I coined, which seems to have caught on, showing the sort of beveled edges of the silver box, because it reminded me of a boiled sweet. But that's the first time I heard that, and I thought that's interesting because, of course, new wave had been used was being used extensively at that time in relation to post-punk music, both in North America and Britain. And that was something I was interested in. So it started with that, and I'll just show you some more copies of Deathbird Stories. That's some of the Dylans, which I know you like as well. The Dylans did great art, and Harlan was a big, big fan of them. And this is my hardcover first. So as you can see, a big Ellison fan. And I discovered Ellison about 1980 through a friend of mine called Phil, who was a very gifted artist and animator. And he and I were in school together, and he introduced me to Ellison because he had a book called The Illustrated Ellison, which I've got a copy of. I should have got it down, which has a lot of classic Ellison stories in it. And one of them is illustrated by Jim Steranko, the great comics artist. And he, as a visual artist, is very interested in that. So that's how I got into Ellison, and that's how I discovered the term New Wave. Now, Phil also got me reading, I can't remember if he got me reading Ray Bradbury or whether we started about the same time, but I do have a memory of him having a hardcover edition of the Martian Chronicles, which I coveted. But somebody he convinced me to read was Michael Moorcock. So this is around about 1980. This is my first copy of the final program. This is a reissue from around about that time, and I borrowed my friend Phil's copy, which is a paperback, and then I ordered this from a bookshop. It was the first book I ever ordered, and I ordered it from a bookshop, which within a couple of years I ended up working at that bookshop, and then I lent this to a friend of mine, another friend, my friend Steve Holmes, who does some of the music on my channel, and then he had this book until about a year and a half ago, so it disappeared from my collection. And really reading this, the final program, which was published in New Worlds magazine, is what really got me into New Wave. And I can't remember how I made the connection between Moorcock and Ellison, because of course the American New Wave is a different thing. It's more about taboo breaking and the things that publishers wouldn't let writers do in North America. In Britain, that wasn't such a problem. We'd had some big obscenity trials, and the whole thing was thrown out the window. But I do have a feeling that it may well be that this book was the first real New Wave book I had, which is the New SF, edited by Langdon Jones. And this is a really great anthology, which everybody should pick up. Really fantastic stuff. So I'm not certain, but really it was reading the final program, and this is the UK first edition, and very beautiful book and a very uncommon book now. And one of the few hardcover books I got by Michael Moorcock, which isn't signed, because Mike signed loads of books for me over the years. And this really was something which was a very 60s book, and it was originally published as a serial in New Worlds. And because he couldn't get regular publishers to sell it, but it became a bit of a cult celeb. And I'll just show you a copy of New Worlds from that period. And that's Jerry Cornelius, the central character of the final program. And this is kind of an iconic issue of New Worlds, which had a massive impact. I mean, it was a kind of counterculture magazine then. It wasn't just an SF magazine. So there was a connection to all sorts of things going on in Britain at the time, the same as in North America, discontent on campus, the Vietnam War, people using psychoactive substances. So it was something which really sort of tapped in to youth consciousness. And what can I say? I was young, so there you go. So that really is how I sort of discovered it. And I sort of played my own part then of proselytizing and trying to push New Wave SF. Long time after it had become part of the literary mainstream, through my friendship with Christopher Priest. And this is a copy of Real Time World Plus 2. And I wrote the blurb on the back of this. And this is the sort of complete edition of this book, which you could get from his website. I'm not sure what's happening with that at the moment. So yeah, New Wave was really important to me. And really, it was John Wyndham that pushed me that way. Because Wyndham, of course, had a literary sensibility and was very British. And quite sort of downbeat, the end of empire, what have you. And he was also very pastoral as well. And I grew up in the country. I had a pastoral background. So there was always a conflict in my personality in responding to the arts between the pastoral and wanting something more energetic and technological. So those two things together. So that's how I discovered New Wave, a long answer and a rambling one. But that is pretty much what got me into that. And it was the material that had the biggest impact on me because of those writers like Doyle, Wells, Wyndham. I had that sort of background in solid English prose. And also George Orwell was really important to me as well. So there we go.
I'm just curious, before we get to Roberts, who I believe is a New Wave writer, you had mentioned you love the pastoral and the technology.
Yeah,
so how do you feel about Clifford D. Simak?
Simak has never really resonated with me, and it's strange because he has some very passionate followers, and obviously things like City with the Dogs is very, very pastoral. And the first book I read by him was The Werewolf Principle, which I remember enjoying a lot. The house being something that was an AI, and I thought that was a really good idea. But Simak has never really resonated with me. And funnily enough, in the 1980s, when I started my bookselling career, Simak was published by Methuen, who had a very small SF list, a good one, but a very small one. And Simak was an author I always found very difficult to sell, and he seemed to be out of fashion even then. To me, he seems rather like Bradbury, but not at the same sort of quality of things. But you can never tell. Maybe I've got some Simak I haven't read. I've got a very nice short story collection which was gifted me about 2 years ago by Mike at Fine Edition Books. He was a dealer who's not active now, which is a really nice book, and maybe it'll happen. But at the moment, Simak hasn't really done it for me. But there's still time. We'll see.
All right, let's get to our main course here.
Yeah.
We exchanged some books, and the book you sent me was a true first hardcover edition of The Chalk Giants.
Yeah.
This book was actually even featured in one of your videos as you went around to some of the sites. There we go.
Yeah.
And so I was really excited. And I had this previous edition here that was, let's see where it is. It's Berkeley.
Yeah.
And it is missing the first two chapters, and it's missing some sort of between chapters
interstitial intermission parts are missing, aren't they? I've never actually seen a copy of it. I've seen it online, and I want one so I can do some close textual analysis. But yeah, it's Keith Roberts himself was very unhappy about the US edition, and he felt that the guts had been ripped out of it. So I keep bulking in terms of buying one, because I've never seen one in the UK. There's quite a few out there, so at some point I will need to get one, because it is a sort of key text for me, and I want to do a close comparison. But yeah, so it's interesting. It's not an easy book. This is my first, which I got this from Dorset Bob. You will have seen Dorset Bob on my channel, also on Jules's channel, and he's got his own channel now, which is called Mr. Book 451, because he's a book dealer. And this is a picture on the cover of Corfe Castle, which is in the video, which we hope to link to, because I visit Corfe Castle, and yeah, that's it, absolutely. And Corfe Castle is in Dorset, and it's probably about an hour and a half drive from me. You don't get to see the fossils, not that big anyway, but they're there. But it's a chalk.
You won't have a gun and a grenade in the fossils either.
No. That's an interesting touch, which becomes relevant when you read the book. But yeah, so in that video you'll have seen, and hopefully we put a link in, I go to various locations where some of Keith's work is set, locations from Pavan, from Kite World, and also from the Chalk Giants as well. And that was a great shoot. I'd love to do more like that. It was done over 2 days, really good weather. But yeah, it's a very interesting book, and I've been flicking through it today and last night, and I'm intrigued, before I go any further, to hear what you thought of it before we kind of sort of deconstruct it a bit, because it is a challenging one.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I'll just mention before that a book of his that I really loved was Pavan.
Yeah.
And it is a group of short stories that are thematically together in an alternate history. So when I came here, this is not, he doesn't do exactly fix-up novels or even collections. It's almost a thematic fix-up novel is what I see from and from this.
Very much so. I think one term that's been used with Keith's work is that he wrote mosaic novels, and he used to get asked about this in interviews, because very few of his novels, it's not until later on, when he was being published by small presses, which we can come on to, that he was just writing novels. And more or less all of the novels were written episodically and published in magazines or anthologies. Even The Furies, his first novel, was published in SF Impulse in parts. And Keith was fundamentally the editor of Impulse. He did most of the work. When he was working on Impulse, I just need to go back in time a bit to talk about Impulse. Impulse was originally called Science Fantasy, and it was part of a stable of two magazines, Science Fantasy and New Worlds. And when Michael Moorcock came onto the scene in 1962 as the new editor of New Worlds, everybody thought that he would take Science Fantasy, because he had Elric stories published in Science Fantasy, and he went for New Worlds, which surprised everybody. And at that time, the chap who was editing Science Fantasy was a writer called Kirill Bonfiglioli. And he was quite a raffish sort of guy, and apparently quite lazy. He was a good writer. And he was nominally the editor, but Keith used to do most of the work. And then Harry Harrison came along and took over after Bon, as he was called, did about 10 issues. And there was a moment when it looked like J.G. Ballard was going to be the editor of Impulse. And there was a confrontation between Ballard and Roberts in the offices, which, one legend says that it was nearly a fist fight and that Michael Moorcock had to pull them apart. And I haven't asked Mike about that. I do want to ask him about that, because Keith was an interesting and difficult man. But going back to the question, from the beginning, the novels were sort of stitched together. And Pavan, this was how I discovered Keith. This is the King Penguin edition of Pavan from the early 80s. And I don't think I'd ever read anything about Keith. And this got reissued at that point. It was in and out of print. And even by then, it was established as the great alternate history novel. And I think I might have read about it in a book by Anthony Burgess called 99 Novels, the Best Books in English Since the War, because Pavan is in that. And I was blown away by it. It sort of ticked all my boxes. But even earlier books like The Inner Wheel is a fix-up, Molly Zero is a fix-up. So they're kind of mosaic novels, and some are more mosaic-like than others. And The Chalk Giants is probably the strangest mosaic of all of them. So it is quite a challenging thing. And he was asked the question about why he did that. And I think it was mostly because he was a working guy. He was never a full-time writer, despite his great skill and despite his massive critical reputation, which was always pretty high. But Keith was a difficult person to work with. Publishers struggled with him. Other writers struggled with him. And that kind of held his career back. Also, I think he wasn't essentially that commercial as a writer, as I think, that a book like The Chalk Giants really shows. And it's a very, very challenging book indeed. But as I say, I'm very keen to hear what you thought about it.
Well, I found, because I knew that these chapters were missing, I found the framing chapters and the interstitial pieces very interesting, because it told the story of a world that was coming apart and there were bombs falling, and somebody was fleeing to a house where their friends they were going to meet there, or their so-called friends. This person was 40 years old, I believe, balding, and not really in touch with his feelings or what others may be feeling about him, about their opinions of him. And he had this infatuation with a young girl, and it definitely wasn't returned. And so that was the start of it. And then all of a sudden I was plunged into what looked to me like something from, I don't know, 1200 AD perhaps, a story of the sort of tribal culture that was in England. And we had a story that was in two parts about a woman who was first a slave, but eventually she moves into another story as an older lady. And in some ways, she is a protagonist in one and an antagonist in the other one. And there continues to be some more stories with some minor connections. And there's one mention in one story, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because you know this far better, but it talks about a vehicle in one story, and all of a sudden I'm going, is this in the past like it reads to me, or is this in a future, a post-apocalyptic future?
I think The Chalk Giants, the way I read it is that it, as you say, it begins in the near future, and of course it was published I think about 1973, and Stan Potts, the central character, who as you say is somebody who hasn't really made connections with people, and you begin by feeling for him very much. And he drives this vehicle which is called a champ. Now I had to look up an Austin champ, and it's basically like a military jeep. And he obviously stops it up, and he goes to this pub which is beneath Corfe Castle. And in the video where I visit Corfe, I was wondering which pub was it, because there's several pubs there. There's no way of knowing. And what I found fantastic about this was that Keith is very good at sympathetic, but rather down at heel, unattractive male protagonists. And he does that with Jesse Strange in Pavan, of course, the driver of the traction engine, who again pops up later on in the narrative. And the interstitial parts in this book seem to be in Stan Potts' head. And the opening sequence, which is about 40 pages long, the first couple of chapters, where there's this run-up, obviously, to a nuclear war, I think are absolutely brilliant. And they're very harsh, and you feel the emotions, and they're very tragic. And Potts is coming to understanding that he's not wanted by these people, who he's sort of teamed up with, is quite an interesting thing. And then, as you say, it goes off at a tangent. And there's that incredible story which follows the initial parts called Monkey and Prue and Sal, which is the very strange one, where there's this young character who's called Monkey, who's in a truck, and then you wonder about, is it the Austin champ? Is it that? But it can't, because it's wood, and he's with these two women called Prue and Sal. And you begin to think about things like Ridley Walker and other classic post-apocalyptic narratives like Candle for Leibowitz, and you're wondering how long after is this? And then the subsequent stories, you can't tell whether they're in the past or the future at times. And because of the intermission sections, which are usually from Stan's viewpoint, you have this incredible thing where, is he seeing into the past or the future? Is he just hallucinating or dreaming these things? Or are they things which have or will happen? And I think that sort of comes back to the fossils on the cover with the gun and the grenade. And it's almost like a meditation on that part of the country. And Keith lived in that part of the country and he loved it. He lived in the sort of western sort of home counties, Oxfordshire, Dorset, Wiltshire, and really it's a book about place more than anything else. And it's a book which I must say I still find befuddling at times, and he did some very complex work, but I also think it's incredibly powerful and beautiful as well, and it's something I can go back to and read episodes from. So if you, I guess what I would say to anybody like yourself in North America, if you buy that Berkeley edition, the hardcover or paperback, it's the bowdlerized one, isn't it? So hopefully you'll be able to find the UK hardcover is really uncommon. This is the more common Panther, which does pop up now and again with an incredible cover there. But yeah, it really is quite something, isn't it? And even though Keith wrote more accessible books like Pavan and the Furies, it has become one of my favorites, I have to say. So, but yeah, its mysteries remain even after 2 or 3 reads. But that's the beauty of it. So I think if you want something challenging, the Chalk Giants really is quite something.
And your video that gave me a glimpse of what the countryside is and Corfe Castle was definitely very helpful, because as somebody from North America who's never seen it or doesn't understand the land that Keith is talking about, it gave me a bit of an idea. And do you want to just refer to what a chalk giant is?
Well, the Chalk Giants in this, of course, the whole area the book is set in Wiltshire. Wiltshire is literally about, let's see, it's about 15 minutes walk from where I live. I'm right in the corner of a county. And then Dorset is beyond that, but slightly more southwards. And there's a lot of chalk. The sort of geology is chalky, and Britain is quite chalky anyway. I heard the other day that chalk streams or chalk rivers, we have a river or a stream, which the base of which is chalk, 75% of them in the UK, and they're very uncommon. And if you go into Wiltshire, which I do a little bit in the videos, and into Dorset, you have these things where there are chalk figures, mostly horses, carved into the rocks, and some of them are quite recent, they're Victorian. So the Chalk Giants, I think, refers to the moments in the stories which are definitely set in the future, where the people are looking back and there are these half memories in the landscape, the remnants of technology or buildings, or of Corfe Castle itself, which is in the final sort of story as such, where the Chalk Giants are the people who once were the kings of technology, you know, before the atomic war. And also in that video of mine, there's a place called Cairn Abbas, and there's a very famous chalk giant there, which has a very boldly displayed club and phallic symbol. And it's very, very hard to photograph it. Whatever you do, you've got to have a drone, really. And I think it's a two-way thing. So I guess maybe it's talking about power and the landscape, and the fact that throughout Britain's history, being a nation that hasn't been fully conquered for like 1,000 years since the Norman conquest in 1066, maybe it's saying something about that. But it's a multi-layered text. But the Chalk Giants, I think, are the great technological gods of old, the people of our civilization before the bomb drops and before everything goes a bit wrong. So I think that's what it means. But also it means figures sort of carved into fields. So it's one of those books that's full of clues. Like, for example, one of the stories is called Usk the Joke Man. And Usk, of course, is like a jester. And Usk is a river in South Wales. And there's a character in there called Arthur, which makes you think of Arthur. And you immediately think, well, maybe this is set in the past. But it does seem to be set in the future. So it's quite something. So if anybody wants a challenging read that takes on science fiction, landscape, history, classic post-apocalyptic scenario done in a different way, then I think the Chalk Giants is the thing.
Yeah. And that chalk giant with the large phallic symbol
Yeah,
prominently in one of the stories as well
that's right.
as they are getting
Yeah,
attacked.
very much so. Yeah, very much so. And Kernabis is an interesting place. Dorset is great where Dorset Bob lives. I'd love to live there, but it is quite an expensive place to live. So you have to be a book dealer like Bob, really. But I also in the video referred to this is a book which this is Kite World, which is very much the thing I've been meaning to do soon on my channel and say to people that if you've read Pavan and enjoyed it, your next stop really should be Kite World. And this is the US Arbor House edition. And you'll see it's got quite a nice cover. I've got a UK one as well. Now, Keith hated this cover because the kites in the book are not like this, and he described them very well. And Keith was an artist. Behind me, the two prints you can see are prints of his artwork done for two small press editions. And fundamentally, he was a printer, an artist, illustrator, and he could be very, very difficult about his book covers and his work. And they were donated to me by a friend, Ben Staveley Taylor, who was part of one of the small presses, where Keith spent his last sort of 10 years of life getting his books issued. You know, the big publishers wouldn't touch him because he was such a difficult man. You know, it's a great shame. And he fell out with everybody, though he seemed to get on with Michael Moorcock. And he also seemed to get on with my old friend Christopher Priest as well. But nearly everybody else he fell out with, and he was quite a difficult guy, but well worth reading. So if you haven't read Pavan out there and you're watching Richard, you should. And then if you have, give Kite World a try because it's fantastic. And this too is episodic. It was published in parts in different magazines, and there was a sequel called Drek Yarman. Drek Yarman has never been published in book form. So there you go. An episodic life, Mr. Roberts, very much so.
You know what? One of the things as I was coming back into science fiction that I discovered, I started reading novels, but there's a lot of authors whose best work, almost only work, is short stories. It seems to be a field that really lends itself well to the short form for some of the authors, at least.
Well, I think, Harlan Ellison's a classic example of that. I mean, he did write novels early in his career. There's a couple of mainstream novels, and one of them is a juvenile delinquent novel. Another is a kind of rock and roll exploitation novel. And there are short SF novels. But of course, Ellison never really wrote novels after that. He wrote short stories and screenwriting. And, you know, we have to remember the genre SF started in 1926 in magazines. It started in magazines. What we think of as science fiction and what's marketed and packaged as science fiction began in magazines. And you know, short stories were the thing, and these days they're sort of dying away. But if you look at, you know, a lot of the sort of great SF authors of any stripe, whether you like Golden Age, whether you like 50s social satire, whether you like New Wave, or anything, you know, conquering the short story is very much a thing for most SF writers, or was. Now there are very few markets, and it's a great shame because some of my favorite writing, I mean, Alfred Bester, you know, everybody reads Bester's famous two novels, his first and his third novel, The Demolished Man and Tiger, The Stars of My Destination. His second novel, of course, is a mainstream novel. But not many people read the short stories, and I think the short stories are better. So it is that thing. So what we need at the moment is, you know, we need more SF short stories, but the market doesn't pay for them because a lot of people just say, I don't like short stories. But, you know, there are plenty of writers I like who I prefer their short stories to their novels, you know. It is just one of those things. And I think you've got to get good short stories under your belt if you want to explore, you know, the breadth of what SF can do, really.
One little rabbit trail before we're done here.
Yeah.
Just because of the cover of this book, have you read Them Bones by Howard Waldrop?
Yeah. It's, there's a kind of similarity there to the sort of cover thing. Howard.
But it's just the theme, right? It is, or there's three plot lines, and one plot line is a 1929 archaeology dig where they find some items that are obviously from the future, which is very strange to find.
Yeah,
and I just finished reading it, and there will be a video about it, but I loved it. It was great.
Yeah, he was a very, very funny guy, you know, and I never met him, but a friend of mine, Lee Kennedy, who's a SF right from Texas. She's resident in the UK. She had a very short, very distinguished career, and she was a big fan of Howard's, and they collaborated on at least one story. But yeah, the anachronistic fossil is an interesting one, and you see all these videos on YouTube pop up on it, and it does make you think. So yeah, that's an interesting one, really is.
All right, Stephen.
Yeah,
This has been great. I really appreciate you coming to the channel here with for this time.
my pleasure. It's been great to talk to you, and if you have a look at my channel, I do have a members area which I've recently launched, and there'll be more of me and Richard in there. And I thoroughly enjoyed your channel. I look forward to your videos, and the way you've systematically worked through things has been a real contrast to my scattershot, what do I feel like doing thing, which I reserve the right to do, because I think I put my time in. So I'm being kind to myself and doing that. And I can never stick to a schedule. I've got enough schedules in life. I've still things,
I don't really put together a TBR, but I do have, publisher series that I'm trying to go through eventually, but I do like the scattershot in between as well.
Yeah, you've got to mix it up. If you're going with that, you can't. It is too limiting. You've got to go with what you feel sometimes, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's been great to talk to you, Richard. And
all right.
I shall see you next in my club room. Thanks a lot.
Great. And as I always say, keep reading.